works and lives under occupation in the West Bank, I believe, Ramallah area. He writes frequently on Palestinian affairs and has been widely published in leading outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, Haaretz, Huffington Post, Brookings Institution, Al Jazeera, America, and about 2 other dozen outlets here on this piece of paper. He's also been on NPR, CNN, BBC, and numerous other radio and TV programs. Sam was recently profiled in the new book, Kingdom of Olives and Ash, edited by Michael Chabon, who I believe is from Pittsburgh, right? Yeah, how about that? The chapter about him may also be found at the literary hub, The Tallest Man in Ramallah, also by Michael Chabon. So let's make him welcome, please. Jules Sabeel, who will be offering brief introductory remarks, is the past president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He is a professor in the law school at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a Jewish activist for human rights in Palestine and Israel. He wrote a kind of autobiographical memoir a few years ago, modestly titled, if I remember correctly, Success Without Victory, or Victory Without Success, or Success Without Victory. So please make him welcome as well. He'll be speaking to us.
Just briefly, thank you for mentioning that book. I was going to call it My Life as a Loser, but the publisher said it wouldn't sell, say Success Without Victory. Actually, that's a good lead-in, because I first met Sam Bahour, who was to me an inspirational figure because of the struggle that he's waged and the good work to really develop and help Palestinians that he's done. But I first met him close to 30 years ago, when Palestinians here in Youngstown and in Pittsburgh were involved in a struggle against a U.S. company, Federal Labs, which was selling tear gas to Israel, which Israel used in the first Intifada to kill Palestinians. They were misusing the gas. They knew that the Federal Labs knew that the Israelis' army was misusing the gas, shooting it into enclosed places and killing people, and they continued to sell it to Israel. And Sam led a whole struggle in which they got busloads of people from Youngstown to protest and demonstrate in front of the Federal Labs facilities, which was in Sloatsburg, PA, about 50 miles from Pittsburgh. And based on Sam's struggle, and based on the struggle of the Palestinians against this American company, which was complicit in the human rights violations that Israel was committing at that time on the West Bank, we at the Center for Constitutional Rights brought a lawsuit against Federal Labs on behalf of the Palestinians who had been killed, or the families of the Palestinians who had been killed or injured by the Israeli misuse of Federal Labs tear gas. And it was one of the cases that I talked about in this book, because we got pretty far, actually. The federal district court judge held that a U.S. company could be held liable for sales to the Israeli army, which then misused the tear gas. But then, after we won that initial victory, the way we had gotten into court was by saying Palestinians are citizens of a foreign state, or aliens, and they're suing an American citizen, namely this company, and therefore they have a right to be in federal court. Eventually, somebody very smart on the other side, actually Abe Sofair, who used to be the legal advisor to the U.S. State Department, said, tell us what country these Palestinians are citizens of. And that raised an enormous legal battle involving the King of Jordan, who sent a letter to the court saying, even though they're not Jordanian citizens, because this was after the Declaration of Independence by the PLO, even though they're not Jordanian citizens, they are protected by Jordan. They travel under Jordanian passports, and the U.S. court found that they were stateless, and as stateless people, they had no rights to sue in federal court. Just another slap in the face of the Palestinians. We then actually sued in state court, and we got a settlement for some of the people who were so injured. But that's how I first met Sam, leading the struggle against federal labs. So I've known him for over 30 years. In that time, he hasn't flinched one bit in terms of his support and struggle for the Palestinian people. That support led him to decide to relocate to Palestine. He, I think, lives in Ramallah, and the decision to do that, as he will tell you all this in much greater depth, but his decision to do that was motivated by a desire to actually help develop the economic basis of the Palestinian state. As a businessman, he wanted to invest. He wanted to show that Palestine could actually develop. And you would think that the Israelis would want that if they really want a partner. But no, it appears the Israelis don't want that, because when I then met Sam again when he was coming back to the United States, because his family still is in Youngstown. And like most people, if you live somewhere and you're a citizen of the United States and you go back to the United States, you can go back to the country that you've been living in. And certainly American Jews can do so. Any American Jew could relocate in Israel. But Sam had to wage a diplomatic fight, which involved the New York Times, the U.S. State Department, just to return to his home in Ramallah. Because the Israelis were going to block him and say, if you come in back to visit the United States, even though you're a United States citizen, we're not, and there's no question that you're not a terrorist, you're a business person, you have ties in the West Bank, clearly, we're not going to let you back in because we don't want you back in. And it took the tremendous fight and publicity and the efforts of the U.S. State Department eventually to get Israel to let a U.S. citizen back into the West Bank. So Sam's continued to fight for all these years, both for the economic development of the Palestinians and for their rights. He is a courageous, in my view, heroic figure, an inspirational figure, because he combines the political struggle, the ideological struggle, as well as the practical economic battle for peace and justice in the Middle East. And with that, the example.
I'm not sure we need this, but I'll just let it sit still. We do. Hello. Good evening. Thank you for that very, very warm welcome. I should note that I wasn't sure how many people were going to show up tonight, so I brought my wife, my sister, my father, my two daughters, and my husband, just to be safe that somebody would be in the room. So you have the whole family with you here tonight. I want to first thank Jules, of course, a friend with all the meaning of that word, and I also respect his professionalism and consistency on this topic as well at some very difficult times. Kate, of course, who found out that I was coming on vacation and said, no, you're not, come to Pittsburgh. Palestine Solidarity Committee, of course, and Sabeel in Pittsburgh. So thank you all. And walking in, I told Jules, you know what? Where progress really still happens in America is in basements of churches. So I'm very, very pleased to be with you. And I brought my uncle, too. I just saw him came from Meriden. Hi, Joel. I did immediately accept this invitation because first, I have a lot of respect for the work that those in solidarity with Palestine have done traditionally here. And I heard that it's been a little bit tense the last couple of months with different visitors coming and going. But to be very, very honest again, I've been here now for 1 week and I've been watching, I'm a news addict, so I've been watching the news very closely. And I'm wondering if I should go back home and create a United States Solidarity Committee. We have issues in America that need addressed. time I'm done tonight that we can link what I'm going to be talking about to how broke our system is here and how much the Americans should be giving the Palestinians a huge plaque to say thank you for exposing how broke our political system is. Then together we can try to fix it. And I do think that the Palestinian issue per se, specifically, uniquely, has exposed some of the largest cracks in our democracy that are being today under Trump abused to the nth degree. Before I tell you about moving back to Palestine, I should note that before I left, and Jules noted this as well, I was very active in the Palestinian issue, growing up in a Palestinian home, and active with the Palestine Solidarity Committee nationally. Actually, it was called the November 29th Coalition before that. November 29th being a very, Dan, you remember that, a very important date for Palestinians, or for this conflict as a whole. November 29th was the day that the partition plan was created in 1947, Plan 181, UN Resolution 181. It's also the day that the United Nations identified as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians. So that day represents a lot to us as Palestinians. And during the first Intifada, before the first Intifada, I'm active on campus. That's where I was. I'm coming to Pittsburgh, talking to people here, a lot of familiar faces. And then the first Intifada broke out. And I'll talk a little bit later about the details of that. But when it broke out, I don't know how many of you have passed by Youngstown during the last 20 years, but they cover international news like in 4 lines per week in the paper. I had much more appetite for news at that time, so I picked up and I went on a very structured trip. And we drove all around, every day going out, seeing everything from the occupied Golan Heights all the way to the end of Gaza and everything in between. And when I tell my daughters this part of my life, and they look at me very starry-eyed, wow, how'd you do that? And I'm like, I didn't even tell you what I did. Do what? And they're like, you landed in Tel Aviv, you took a car, and you drove to Ramallah, and then in the morning you would get up and drive to Gaza, or drive to the sea, or drive to the Galilee? Wow. Says a lot about an entire generation that can't do that. That can't drive 45 minutes without being stopped. No wonder there's a community in Palestine that sometimes acts irrational. I wonder what would happen if you got stuck in this neighborhood only for 50 years. A lot to be said about that. So I went on this trip, came back home, and I was pissed off when I came home for 2 reasons. One, as a Palestinian, everything I had learned up until that point, I saw come to life. And reality was much worse than what I had read and what I studied and all the oral history that I got from my family. So as a Palestinian, it made me very uncomfortable that that can be happening and the world doesn't know about it. And then as putting on my American hat, I was also very disturbed. Why? At that point, during that trip, I came to realize that this military occupation would not exist if it was not for the United States of America, period. And having 25 years of living on the ground now, I think I can talk for the whole 3 hours they have planned, but I won't, to make that case. And then during that time as well, we took several groups. I started taking my own groups there. Danny came with us as a photographer once. And then we also had the Salzburg, Pennsylvania Federal Laboratories case that Jules mentioned. And I found myself chained with about 6 other people on the gates of that factory in Salzburg, Pennsylvania, which is in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So we got all excited. We're singing in the buses, getting here, and we arrived to woods. There's nobody to see us. There's nobody to take a picture. And then out of the blue, we hear helicopters coming out. Like state police kind of people coming on horseback. I'm like, what's going on? There's nobody here. I mean, it's only the trees who are hearing our chants. And I guess they expected a bus of Palestinians is just too much to deal with. The end of that period resulted in me meeting 2 close friends, and they're friends of Jules as well, Stoughton and Alice Lynn. You may know them. If you're labor-oriented, for sure you know them. Stoughton and Alice came to me after the first Gulf War in about 1991, and I never saw them before. I actually was in the Presbyterian church in Youngstown giving a talk, and they were sitting in the back. They're elderly. They were elderly then. And after the talk, they came up to me and they said, "Hi, I'm Stoughton, my wife Alice. First time that we've met you. Can we come to your home?" I'm like, "Why?" We'd like to continue the discussion. They look like they can't hurt me. I'm kind of a big guy. Next Saturday, they came to my house. I was living with my television on, which I'm a news addict, as I said. And Stoughton walked in. This person doesn't really know me. They sat down and said, "Can you turn off the TV?" Turned off the TV. "How would you like your coffee?" We sat down. And they explained to me that they are civil rights / human rights / labor activists for a very long time. Google wasn't as good as it is today, but I found my way to find out who they were. Long story short, they said, the way we learn conflicts is that we like to go. And while we're going, we actually write an oral history about the people that we're going to visit. That took, I thought, oral history, okay, we can write a story, that's not a big deal. So I said, okay. That was a trick question, that they set it up perfectly, so I would say okay. And we set up a trip. I was going anyway, so I said, "You guys can follow me, we can come together on this trip." And we went to Ramallah, and every day they would go out with us to these field trips, and we would record. Okay, we made many, many recordings. And Stoughton and Alice would be asking these very, very precise questions. And I was translating and so forth. We got back home. A couple weeks later, they said, "Can we come back to your house for coffee?" I said, "Sure." And by this time, we're friends. And they said, "We've transcribed all of the talks. You actually typed up everything that was said during a 2-week trip. And we need to go back. We have some gaps, and we need to fill those gaps." And I said, "I thought we were done. Don't we just want to write an article about your trip?" They said, "No, this is a real oral history. And we have to corroborate all information gathered." So it put me in a 2-year whirlwind of learning how to do oral history. That book is called Homeland. It's a little bit old now, but the talk in it is exactly what we're facing today, and you're encouraged to see that at your library. And then, as we were here, I got, the first Intifada was kind of fading away. It was no longer a rallying call for these trips. So I had to make a strategic decision. What's my relationship to Palestine? I'm an activist, I've gone on these trips, but the trips are kind of not as exciting as they were before because the Intifada was slowing down. So I took a strategic decision to get married to a Palestinian woman. She's right there. And we just had our 25th anniversary, so that worked. And I got married in Palestine, and I did exactly what the Israelis want. I plucked a Palestinian out of Palestine and brought her to Youngstown, Ohio. And I say that because I come from a school of thought which says the core of this conflict, once we peel away all the different layers, the religious layer, the spin layer, the haspara layer, what are we left with? We're left with land and people as they are related, not as they are separate. What do I mean? I don't think the Israelis wake up in the morning and think about what my father is doing in Youngstown, Ohio. They can care less. It's when Sam, the Palestinian, decides to go live on the land and people as they are connected, that I become a subject of the conflict. So bringing Abir, my wife, to Youngstown relieved the Israelis of one subject of the conflict. And I was working in software development, she got a retail job, we had our first daughter, that's the one in the back wall. And basically, we got surprised, not only by our daughter, but we got surprised by the fact that the Oslo Peace Accords were announced. The two sides came together and signed an interim agreement that was supposed to lead to peace. As an avid reader, I had to read this document. I half-jokingly say that I'm one of 12 Palestinians worldwide that read the document. Most people like to critique it. Very few have read it. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it tells you about 20, 25 years of why we are at the low point that we are today. Youngstown Library is not on the brink of news. So I actually had to get a copy from the Jewish Community Center in Youngstown. I read it. I was very happy that they gave it to me, and I was fuming when I finished reading it. Because I was politically aware, I read the document and said, this is a setup. And I'm not proud to say that I was right. I would wish I was wrong and peace would have broken out by now. But when I read the agreement, I said, this can't work. And I started activating myself. I left a paper trail of op-eds behind me. And when I got home one day, my wife looked at me kind of weird and said, what's wrong with you? Everybody we know is excited. The two sides came together. You're not the only person we know that's against this agreement. And she said, can you read it again? But this time with a business eye, not a political eye. You're over-politicizing this. Yeah, my wife, we have a new daughter, so I read it. And I found something in the agreement that caught my attention. And just very briefly, just to give you the frame, what's the agreement? The agreement is a 5-year. It has a date. It's like milk. It's going to spoil after 5 years. And that was in 1993. We're still drinking from that milk by now, by the way. And it said in 5 years, and there was 2 parts to the agreement. Part number 1 was a set of principles. Part 2 was a set of annexes. What were the principles? The principles were very unoriginal. They were not exciting. They were actually issues or themes that were drawn from past UN resolutions. Things like UN Charter, which said land acquired by force is inadmissible in international law. You can't just flex your muscles as a country and take the country next to you. Someone tweet that to Trump right now. Other things like Resolution 242 and 338, which basically called for the end of the military occupation. All of that came into the first part of the agreement. The second part of the agreement was about 4 dozen annexes. There was an annex for every sphere of Palestinian life. You may have heard by now about areas A, B, and C. Some people are shaking their head. A being the population areas, B being the rural areas, and the rest, 62% of the West Bank, being in full Israeli control up until today. That's how this agreement classified the land. Well, that was an annex. It was the annex on land. There was an annex on agriculture, an annex on water, an annex on petroleum, an annex on how you have elections, etc., etc., etc. I got to annex number 36. I just used it because I have it memorized. It was the annex on telecommunications. And it said, first paragraph, and I'm using this as an example, but the rest of the annexes are structured very similarly. It said, the Palestinian side has the right to build, operate, and maintain separate and independent networks. Separate and independent. Those are the words that are used. Came back home and told my wife, you know, politically this is not setting well with me, but separate and independent. Why would they use those words if we were not heading to statehood? Long story short, we picked up and relocated to Palestine. My wife had a hidden agenda to make me reread that agreement. We had just had our first daughter and she was homesick. So she won. I now live in Palestine. We entered Palestine. She went back home. That's where she was born. I entered as the American citizen that I am from Youngstown, Ohio. And I brought some show and tell. My younger daughter says, don't do this because you look like a 5-year-old, but I do it anyway. This is one of my passports. It's actually the 5th one. It's punched out. I have a 6th one that's live. Why do I have so many passports? And why are they so thick? Thicker than yours, probably. It's because when we enter Israel, the only way to enter Israel as an American is as a tourist. And the Israelis stamp your passport every time you enter with a stamp which says 3-month tourist visa. So I've gone through a lot of passports. From 1994 when we moved until 2006, about 15 years I guess, I entered and exited the country every 3 months because I wouldn't be able to stay longer. We don't always get 3 months. Many times the people at the border scratch out 3 months and put 2 months or 1 month. Once my dad and I were coming from Jordan, they scratched out 3 months and put in 2 days. We came home, had a great meal, got up in the morning, went back to Jordan, turned around and came back over the bridge, and we got 3 months. So you can imagine for doing that for 15 years. And when I got to Palestine, I was hired, actually was hired before I got there, but I was involved with implementing that separate and independent Article 36 to create the first Palestinian telecommunications company. That's called Paltel. It's a $1 billion company today. It's the leader of our stock exchange. If you have extra money, buy stocks. They turn around about 40% dividend per year, which is too much, and that's why I left the company. And I did that, and when I got on the ground, one of two people, a second person from Washington, a Palestinian telecom expert, when we got on the ground, we had to read all the fine print in the Oslo Accords. And I want to give you an example of what it had in it and what's being applied up until today. You know how these things work, right? I see some gray hair in the audience, so let me explain slowly. There are no wires connected to your phone. These work on frequencies, airwaves, where the agreement said you have the right to build separate and independent mobile networks. But when you want frequencies allocated to you so you can actually use them, you come back to the Israeli side, and the Israeli side unilaterally will decide if you get frequencies or not. So we did a radio study. We found out we needed, for the sake of our discussion tonight, 6 lanes of frequency. Think of frequency like lanes of a highway. 6 lanes of the airwaves to be able to build a proper optimal network. Optimal in business meaning the cheapest. And we went to the Israeli side. We actually had some British consultants do the study for us because not one university was teaching telecom. Why would they? For 35 years, under full military occupation, you would not be allowed to work in telecom. So there was no need to actually study telecom. Universities didn't provide it. We brought in some British teleconsult, that's the company name, consultants, and these guys came in. I was their counterpart, and they finished their study. They gave us a very big study. And Mr. John Zuber, I think his name was, and he said, we're done, here's the study, thank you very much. I said, wait a second, John. I'd like you to come with us to the Israeli side to present your report. And, Brits are kind of dry people, sometimes. And he's like, why? Everything is in the report. And we said, yeah, we know, I'm sure your report is great, but we think the Israelis might like John and Jim a little bit more than Muhammad and Ahmed. Let's go together. And we go together, we present the report, told the Israeli military officials that we need 6 lanes of airwaves. In a very cordial meeting, they said, sure, we'll get back to you. Took the report. 1 year later, keep in mind time. Time is a weapon in this conflict. It's a very sharp weapon. 1 year later, they come back and they say, sure, you can have frequencies. You can't have the 6 lanes you asked for. You can have 2.5 lanes. And the half must be shared by Israeli companies so they can provide telecommunication services to the settlements in the West Bank. Okay? What did that mean to us business people? It meant, those towers you see on the rooftops? In the optimal network, we were going to build a tower here and a tower here and connect them with 6 lanes of frequency. When they only gave us 2.5, it meant that we had to build additional towers here, here, and here, and connect them with the lower amount of frequency. Every time I say the word tower, think $500,000. So by one Israeli administrative decision, we ended up paying out of our ears to be able to build a proper network. And it's still, till today, not separate and not independent. And I can go more into that later if you'd like, but there's a lot of examples that show that although Israel had given us many rights in the beginning of those annexes, it held all of the resources required to implement those rights throughout the document. So what does that mean? It means I can tell you, if you don't like what I'm saying, you can leave this room anytime you want. But forget to tell you that I boarded up all the doors and the windows, so you have the right, but there's nowhere to leave. And that's the kind of way it was done. And during that period of time, building a company of that size is not easy, especially under those very complicated political parameters. Someone convinced me that maybe Oslo is going to work. First couple years I got there was a buzz in the air. Even those of us that were against the agreement politically could see people are talking, people are visiting Tel Aviv, people are talking about what are we going to do after peace breaks out? How are we going to serve the Arab world? And there became a big business buzz. And I got dumped into it, I guess. And someone said, are you ready? Are you ready if this really works in 5 years and a Palestinian state's created and Israel and Palestine are living side by side? And I said, I think I am. Then I thought, and I have many weaknesses, but there's 2 big weaknesses. One is, I don't know Arabic well. I have since surrendered. I will never know Arabic well, but I'm doing better every day. But the other weakness was, I don't know Israelis out of uniform. At that point, the only Israeli I knew was an Israeli driving a Jeep, wearing military fatigue, stopping us, arresting us. So I said, you know what I want to do? I heard that there's a joint program in Tel Aviv University, it's an MBA program, between Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and Tel Aviv. I went and registered in that program. I was part of the first cohort of that program. 5 or 6 Palestinians, the rest were all internationals or Israelis. For 2 years, I drove my Israeli licensed car. Why Israeli licensed? Because I'm there as a tourist. And I would drive back and forth to Tel Aviv 3 days a week for 2 years. I half-jokingly say that I know the roads of Tel Aviv, and Israel probably in general, better than most Israelis do. And I wasn't a security threat. I was driving, I was on campus, and I got a degree, an MBA degree. I didn't want the degree. That's not why I went. I went to interface with Israelis. And I got 2 years of meeting real people, real engineers, real business people, real housemate people, like general, everybody else. And it gave me a look differently into the Israeli community. And at that point, something happened in Palestine politically. In 2004, Arafat was killed, or died. I'm not the person to say, but he exited the political theater. And when that happened, Arafat was a very powerful leader. Too powerful, but he was a very powerful leader. And everyone, including myself, took a very deep breath because we thought the place was going to implode. Luckily, it didn't. In 2005, we held presidential elections, and President Abbas was elected. Jimmy Carter came with his monitoring team. You know, they stamped our elections kosher, everything was great. And at that point, if you remember, there was a president here called George Bush. He came running to the newly elected Palestinian president. Mr. Abbas, congratulations, you had a proper election. I note here, we had a very democratic election, but it's not a democratic society. Those are two very different things, as the US is learning very quickly. And he said, you know what? We want to help you. You know, we didn't like the guy before you took Arafat. But you, Mr. Abbas, you shave every day and you wear these great Western suits. We can do business with you. We want to help bring democracy to Palestine. And we have such a great track record in Afghanistan and Iraq, now it's your turn. And the way we do this, you know us Americans, we're very inclusive. At least we were up until January 20th, 2017. And we want everybody to be around the table so we can hold parliamentary elections in Palestine and then help you move forward. And Abbas, this newly elected, very non-charismatic person, told the Bush administration, slow down. You don't get it. I'm not Arafat, he said. I'm part of the party that Arafat was from, but I'm no charismatic, symbolic leader. I'm just an elected official. And Arafat didn't leave so many state-like institutions behind. So give me some time to rebuild these institutions, and I promise you we'll have elections. U.S. administration responded, no, Mr. Abbas, you don't get it. You're going to have elections now, or you're going to lose funding. Remember I said I read also and said it wouldn't work? It's because we didn't have access to funding. We didn't have access to resources, to water, to land, to frequencies. So I didn't think it would work. Who filled the gap? The donor community. Your tax dollars helped fill the gap. And we were threatened, basically, that if we did not have, there's seats up here if you like, if we did not have elections now, that we would be withdrawn about 30% of the budget. So I call it blackmail. We were blackmailed into having elections, so we had parliamentary elections. And when that happened, something major happened in the Palestinian political system. Hamas, the Islamist party in our society, out of the blue, called and said, we're running in elections. They had never done so up until that point. And that shocked everyone. It was kind of interesting because I have to give the American side a little bit of credit. Where was Hamas before they joined the electoral process? They were in the trenches. They had a campaign of suicide bombings going on. So it's positive that they came up and came into a very open process. And the US was bragging at that point, you Palestinians, you didn't even want to have elections. Look how smart we are. We called for elections, and now everybody's around the table. Aren't we great? And we said, okay, this time you are. And then election day came, and the wrong party won. Shocking everybody, including Hamas, because they didn't expect to win. And the US, in perfect posture, did what it usually does around the world. It supports a democratic election, but can't swallow the result. If only we could do that here. And at that point, life changed. And I said that historical frame to come back to myself. Remember I said I'm in and out of the country for 15 years, every 3 months or so, to renew my visa. Well, out of the blue, I started hearing that people were being denied entry back into Palestine. Professors, teachers, the head of Coca-Cola, a 78-year-old insurance company chairman, all were being denied entry. The Israelis basically started to punish the Palestinians for voting for Hamas. I didn't vote for Hamas, but it doesn't matter. Israel punishes us collectively. Collective punishment is a trick word. It's a war crime. And I got worried. My visa was coming up for renewal. You can ask my wife, we used to live with that date. When's the next 3 months end? Because you don't want to violate your visa. So I always had a date that I had to leave in mind. So my date was coming up that I had to leave to renew my visa. This time, I packed a proper bag. I thought possibly I'd be denied entry. Usually I'd go in and out, I'd be back before lunch. I headed down to a science. Taxi picks me up at 7 o'clock, I get to the bridge, I cross the bridge. Amman is a very boring place, so I just have a cup of coffee at the bridge, turn around, and come back, and I'm literally home for lunch. This time, I packed a bag and went to Jordan for 3 days. Came back, I was interrogated for about 7 hours. Remember, 15 years, I'm in and out of the country. Every time getting questioned, there's nothing left to ask me. I was sweating. I thought I was being denied entry, but luckily I wasn't. I was given a visa, and that's why I brought you this specific passport. They gave me a visa, and they hand wrote in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, just in case I don't understand, last permit. After 15 years, after building the largest Palestinian company, after getting an MBA degree, I'm told, leave. I get home and tell my wife, we have a problem. We have 3 months to resolve my status here, or we pick up and have to go back to the States. Now remember, I was politically active before going to Palestine. I didn't come to Palestine to leave. So I basically stopped work and activated myself as the activist that I am. And I lobbied very hard. And again, half jokingly, I say I have more Israeli friends than most Israelis have. And I found one guy, Mr. Gission, he passed away a couple years ago, was a very influential business person in Israel. And I called him and I said, this is what's my case, what can I do? He goes, come to my office. So I put on my tie, I went to the Tel Aviv shore where his office was. He was the head of Coor Industries, if anybody knows these companies. And I was there. I actually was in his office almost 10 years prior, almost to the day. Why? Because 10 years prior, his company, he interviewed me, gave me a scholarship to go to that MBA program. And when they gave me the scholarship, they said, we have one condition. And I'm in the back of my head, I'm like, not another Israeli with another condition. But I kept smiling because I wanted the scholarship. Yes, Mr. Gission, what can I do for you? He said, we're going to give you this scholarship. It's an expensive scholarship. Northwestern is not a cheap school. And we don't want you to get the degree and then leave back to the States. 10 years later, I'm in his office, and I reminded him. I said, you told me not to leave, right? He goes, yeah. And I pulled this out, and I said, your country is telling me to leave. What should I do? He told his secretary, call the Israeli Minister of Interior. I was like, yes, I got to the right location. He got on the phone. I don't know Hebrew, but he used all the swear words in Hebrew that I know. And he got off and he said, write up your case, get it translated to Hebrew, and send it to me. And I did that. And a few days later, I get a call that I got a 6-month extension. All that for a 6-month extension. I was worried. I forgot to mention that when we got married in 1993, there was no Oslo, there was no Arafat. It was only the military occupation. We got married in Ramallah, and my wife, the next week, ran to the Israeli authorities and applied for me to get residency in the West Bank. It's like a green card here. And they gave her this slip of paper, which is a receipt in Hebrew. She had it tucked away in her wallet. It turned yellow on the edges. That was in 1993. I get a telephone call. I got a couple more extensions. I got about 3-4 more extensions. So this is like a year and a half, 2 years have passed now. And I get a call from the Israeli military. Hello, Mr. Bahour. Yes. Your residency is ready. You can come and pick it up. Residency? Oh, yeah, the one we applied for in 1993. The call came in May 2009. I almost forgot. I'll be right there. And they said, we close at 2 o'clock. Bring your passport when you come. I'm one of those people who travel frequently alone. So I kind of like read the fine print that's in the passport. These are not ours. This is Department of State property. It's not mine to give to anybody. But I took my chances. I drove my yellow-plated car, Israeli licensed car, to the Israeli Military Administration headquarters and stood in line for about 45 minutes, hour. It took 1 second. Where's your passport? Somebody called me and told me my residency is ready. They opened up my passport, stamped it, and gave me, this is actually my daughter's because I forgot mine at home, and gave me my residency card. This is the residency card. I'll tell you about this in a second. What did they stamp in my passport? It's a Hebrew stamp. I don't read Hebrew, but I know what it says. It says the holder of this foreign passport has been identified in our system as a Palestinian. And they take the number out of this card and they write it in the stamp. So what does that mean? It means if you come and visit me, I can't get in the car with you and go back to Jerusalem. Why? Because if they stop your car and I'm in it, they're going to ask for your visa. And you're going to show them your visa. Today, they don't stamp the passports anymore. They actually give you a small sliver of paper like this. This is the visa. You're going to show them a valid visa. When they get to my passport, they're going to look at it, they're going to say, wait a second. You've been identified as a Palestinian. By the way, my father left Palestine in 1956, before the 1967 Day War. Somebody told him trees have money that grow on them in America. He's still looking at 78, he's still looking for it. So my father wasn't there when the occupation happened. This entire system of residency ID cards happened after the occupation. It's actually the first administrative act of the occupation. They knocked on your door. If you were there, you got a card. And anybody born afterward gets a card. If, like my father and so many others, you were outside working or for health reasons somewhere else or studying abroad, too bad. You lose your ability to go back home. So all the paperwork my father was holding to go back home became worthless. He got stuck. He had to marry my mom somewhere here to be able to become a U.S. citizen, to come today to visit for 3 months as a tourist, just like you. I live in the house he was born in, by the way. So what do I tell the officer? When the officer asks me, and he says, "Where's your visa?" And I say, "All I have is this." And they say, no, here. U.S. passport means nothing to us. Yes, you give us $38 billion a year, but it doesn't matter. $38 billion for 10 years, but it doesn't matter. Where's your ID? At this point, I have 3 options. Option number 1 is to play dumb American, which is very easy to do these days. Officer, what are you talking about? ID, what's that? Not smart, because they actually wrote the ID number in the passport, so they have the number. So that's not a good option. Second option, I'm sorry, officer, I forgot it. People forget things, right? Not smart. Anybody who has been issued a Palestinian ID, as we call them, must have it on their person at all times, especially if you're a male. If I actually do forget this in my office and try to go to a meeting and an Israeli Jeep stops me, as they regularly do, and they ask for my ID and I don't have it on me, I could be arrested on the spot for 6 months. It's called administrative detention. We sleep with our cards. That's how important these are to make sure that we're dealt with. So the only option I really have is not to say I don't know what it is and not to say I forgot it, but to show him my passport, my ID. And I would show him an ID. This is a residency card. It's not statehood. It's not a passport. It's a residency card. It's written in Arabic and Hebrew. Arabic so we can understand, Hebrew so the issuer, the Israeli military, can understand. has my 4-part name, my place of birth, my date of birth, interestingly, my religion, and what cage I live. It doesn't say cage. It says, what's my place of residence? My place of residence is identified as Ramallah. That means I'm not allowed to be in the cage of Gaza, even though Gaza is just as occupied. I'm not allowed to be in the cage of East Jerusalem, even though East Jerusalem, under international law, is just as occupied. Up until recently, I wasn't allowed in the 40% of the Jordan Valley, which was off limits to anyone who didn't live there. So you can see how my life became very constrained to the locality where I live. When I want to go to Bethlehem from Ramallah, how do I go? Well, for 15, 20 years, I get in the car and I go south from Ramallah, cross Jerusalem, and I'm in Bethlehem. It takes about 20 minutes. Today, as a resident, even though I'm still a U.S. citizen, how do I go? I go south until I get to the Kalendia checkpoint, which is the northern tip of Jerusalem. I'm not allowed to pass it. Turn left. Go all the way down to the Jordan Valley. That's about a 25-minute ride. Take a right. Drive the Jordan Valley all the way to the Malay Adamim settlement. That's about another 20 minutes. And then take a right and go up a very treacherous road. We call it the Valley of Fire. And that road, Wadi Nar, that will take us into the backside of Bethlehem. Now the West comes and tells us, what are you guys complaining about? Your occupation is not that bad. Look at, you have buildings, you have cafes, you're drinking cappuccinos. They forget that it took 20 minutes to get to Bethlehem. 20 minutes, you use this much gas, this much depreciation on your car, and you're there. Now with the hour and 45 minutes, and by the way, there's 3 checkpoints on the way, they can stop me at any one for any amount of time. There's much more pavement, there's much more lighting. You use this much gas and this much depreciation. I'm a pretty big guy, so I take 3 falafel sandwiches and 2 colas with me just in case the checkpoints stop me. And the US is saying, but your GDP is growing. And I tell them, yes, it is. It's because I'm eating more falafel. I'm spending more gas. There's more pavement. You're absolutely right. We're spending out of our ears to work around the military occupation. By the way, I have to thank each and every one of you. Because most of those roads are built by US aid, which is your tax dollars. I saw some pretty bad roads here. I mean, I think that money would be better used in Pittsburgh. So basically, I end up confined, and now with this, I don't even carry my passport anymore. My passport is home. And what I'm going to say next will make no sense whatsoever, but it's 100% accurate, and I can challenge you to prove me wrong. Every single country in the world, including Iran and Cuba, or we love Cuba now, I can't use them, they all may or may not like Americans, but they all recognize us for who we are. The one country in the world that refuses to recognize me as the American, which is the only thing I am, is the State of Israel. There's something very wrong with that equation as an American. Forget Palestine and Israel. It can't be that we can give $38 billion to a country and that country decide if I'm allowed to use my passport to enter, or if your name is David and you come from Brooklyn, you can enter any way you want. You can even go to the settlement in the middle of the West Bank next to my house and take up residence. There's something wrong with that discrimination. We actually took it, the issue of discrimination, to the State Department. It was the time of Condoleezza Rice, and she got it. She got it very quickly. If you go to the State Department press briefings archive, you'll see that they made 2 statements. Israel, we only have one color passport, it's blue. You cannot differentiate the person holding it. Great words. We're still waiting for the tsunami policy to hit. Nothing happened after those words. 2 other things, then we can open it up, because I don't want to just lecture. I'm writing an article today. I've been writing it for the last couple of weeks. I was challenged by an Israeli friend, because I tell them, you know what? There's 101 things the Israelis can do tomorrow morning, because they are the people who have effective control. Occupation is related to effective control. So they may not be in the middle of the Gaza Strip, but they have effective control if a ship can reach the port or not, or if petroleum can go in or not. And I say there's 101 things that can take place tomorrow morning that the Israelis can do to reduce the tension, even if it doesn't end the occupation. Let's put the occupation aside for a sec. And I said that once, and my friend challenged me. And then a couple years later, he saw me again, and he said, "Did you write the article yet?" So he challenged me, and I love challenges, so I'm writing it now up to about 68. I'll have 100 before I finish this trip. And things like don't discriminate against Americans when they enter. I don't know if you're watching the news, but the last 3 weeks have witnessed not only Palestinians being stopped and questioned at the airport or the border crossings, but people like Peter Beinart, an observant Jewish leader in America who's a journalist, who was questioned. He just wrote an article in the foreword about his experience. Or Aslan, who is a past CNN producer, I believe, who was also questioned. Interestingly, there's about 7 or 8 who have been questioned during the last 3 weeks. They're all my friends. Israel is very clearly wanting to keep people like me out. Not that I'm different. We are people who are calling for the occupation to end. Not for the end of Israel, not for Jews to go anywhere, but for the occupation to get its damn boot off of our neck after 50 years. That's too much for Israel to swallow. So I'm writing this article. This article will have things like, yesterday, I heard from back home, that Israel released 10 tons of postal mail to the Palestinians. It's the mail that has been coming to us from 2010. So if I didn't respond to your postcard, please excuse me. I'll probably get it next week, and I promise you to reply. Things like frequencies above the West Bank are the right of Palestinians. You cannot limit their frequencies. What does that mean? You all have 3G on your phones, or maybe now 4G. I'm almost embarrassed to talk about 3G. We got 3G on our telephones in November of last year. 3G is a fading technology. The world has reached 5G. I was part of this, a 10-year battle with the Israeli side to release the 3G frequency. What would they tell us? Can't. Why? Security. Security, right? Okay. You don't let us have 3G, but you allow the Israeli companies to provide 3G to the settlements. So all I do is I go down to the store down the block, take out my Palestinian phone, I unplug my Palestinian SIM, I plug in an Israeli SIM for about 20 shekels, turn it on, ta-da! I have 3G service coming from the settlements. So how can it be security related if I can get it anyway? I'll give you another example. On the way here, we were leaving our city, and there's 3 ways to leave. One is very congested because that's where the Kalandia checkpoint is, and one is very far north, one south, one north. So I told my wife we're going to go out of the eastern entrance. It's mostly manned by soldiers. Sometimes it's not. So I told her, let's check, it's the closest one. If nobody's there, then we pass and we can get here quicker. And we got there, and there's 2 lanes. I'm driving, there's 2 lanes going out. The right lane had 2 soldiers, the left lane had no one. Is the checkpoint manned or not? So I was actually in the right lane, I took a quick left, I went in the left lane, and I just passed by, waved, and kept going. I didn't even wave at anybody, there's nobody looking at me. And I just went out. And my daughters looked behind and goes, "Dad, they're stopping every car on the right side." Those must be the terrorists. They didn't know how to take a left. It's these arbitrary actions, which I'm going to list in a very long list, to show the Israelis first and foremost, but Americans who have bought into the security mantra, that security is used as a trump card, pun intended, that we have to get past it. Pasta and children's crayons not being allowed to go into the Gaza Strip, that's not a security risk. Now I know if you eat enough pasta, it could be a security risk. It took Keith Ellison, a congressman from Minnesota, to visit Gaza to learn that crayons and pasta were not allowed in the Gaza Strip. This was about 2013. Made a big stink about it, and finally they opened to allow it to go in. So one day it's allowed, one day it's not. One day you can go past the checkpoint, one day you're not. And you cannot go past the checkpoint because it's manned, but if you wait until 5:30, they finish their shift, they go into their camp, and then it's open, you can just pass through. Terrorists are stupid, but they're not that stupid. It's only people like me who go at the wrong time and have to wait in line. I'm sure they pass when there's nobody there. So I'm not sure, other than making our life miserable and trying to get us to leave, because because I honestly believe after 25 years of being there and 25 years prior of studying this conflict, that there is one clear trajectory that Israel has as it relates to us. It's to gain as much Palestinian geography as possible with the least amount of Palestinian demography on it. It's clear that from the visa issue, from the checkpoints, from making us pay more for cost of living, to humiliating us, let alone the wars and the house demolitions and the arrests, it's all made for us to say either leave, if you can leave, or turn violent. And it's working. The younger generation of Palestinians, like my daughters, one just graduated from MIT, the second one I'm taking to Harvard next week. And they're thinking, what am I going to go back home for? The more educated you become in Palestine, the more you have to think 10,000 times before moving back to Palestine. Because they have made sure that the stranglehold on the economy doesn't allow anything productive to happen. And there's two things there. One is, there is economic activity. I actually wrote an article in The Guardian about this. What we should be doing is economic development. We're building a state. We went to Google and looked up, Amazon, how do you build a state? There's no books. It's a sloppy process by design. But we learned the hard way. What are the resources needed to build a state? Land, water, borders, monetary policy, fiscal policy, water, as I said, movement and access, petroleum. You need all the things required to build an infrastructure for a state. We're not allowed to have those. Those are in full Israeli control. What we are allowed to have is economic activity. You can build a mall. I built a mall. You can build a mall. You can build a telecom company that won't be separate, independent. You can build a cafe. You can build a lot of cafes if you'd like. You can build a software company. Nobody's going to stop you. You can do all the things that don't really contribute to infrastructure for a state. And after 25 years, it's not a mistake that we're not allowed to have access to our infrastructure. It's a policy to make sure that we remain subdued to an Israeli economy which is paralyzing our ability to keep our youth in the country. So you either leave or you turn violent, like what's happening in Gaza now. In Gaza, I don't know if you saw the Washington Post article recently, the title was, "They sustained 3 wars. Now mental health is killing them." That's the kind of pressure that's boiling up, and it's going to explode if it hasn't already done so. I have more to say, but I'd rather stop there and we have a discussion, and if anything else I want to say, I can bring it in. I'll end by one thing, and I literally will stop at that point. This is going to take a minute. Where am I going with all this? I can go on and on. I can list you 25 years of what I've seen, but where are we heading? And I like to say where we're heading through the eyes of my daughter's generation. I write frequently, and I got bored of writing. I actually was pulling out articles that I wrote 25 years ago and just changing the dates and the names. They work perfectly. The model of what's there is the same. So before my older daughter came here to go to school, I said, bring some of your kids home. Let me have a talk with them. And whatever they say, I want to write. What are they thinking? And that'll be my new article. And I brought them home, and we had a pizza. I asked my daughter first in front of her peers, do you know that you're militarily occupied? And my daughter, Ari, she just barked back like any good 16-year-old. What do you think, we're stupid? Of course we know that we're occupied. You think we don't know the Mediterranean Sea is 45 minutes from our house and we can't get there? Or Jerusalem is 7 minutes from our house and we can't get there? Dad, if you forgot, we were born during the Oslo process. We've been walled in since birth. Okay, so I jotted all that down. Then she went on, and I'll add a little bit to what she says, from what I'm hearing from that generation. And she said, but Dad, we read our history different than you. How? She said, what happened in 1948 is like 100 9/11s struck us on the same day. How many people died in 9/11? Close to 3,000. How many people died or went missing in 1948 when Israel was created? Close to 800,000 people, 70–80% of the population. So although I understand the analogy, the numbers are way off. No, she's not saying, and her generation is not saying yet who's right and who's wrong. We can have that discussion. They're merely stating a fact that the calamity of the state of Israel being established on the Palestinian people was huge. And she says, what did we do after that? For 10 years, nothing. We were in shock. This is an agricultural community that received a conflict that came from Europe and fell on its head. And plus we were put under military curfew by Israel at that point as well. So for 10 years, almost nothing happened. And then the Palestinians that were left their homes picked up arms and said, we're going back home. And for the next 10 years, we fought. And my daughter reminds me, goes, Dad, if you haven't noticed, we don't know how to fight. Not only that, we're up against the fourth strongest military in the world, a military might in the region, armed to the teeth by the US, a nuclear power. We don't have a chance of fighting our way back. And after 10 years of trying, we shifted gears. Where did we go? We went to the UN. But we didn't go anywhere to the UN. We went to the plumbing of the UN. We memorized the Fourth Geneva Convention. We memorized UN resolutions. And my daughter's generation, they shrug and they say, so what? Dad, you're amazing. You know all those UN resolution numbers, but we're still occupied. And after trying international law for another 10 years, we shifted gears again. And the people under occupation said, enough is enough. We are going to have an intifada, as it's now called. What's the root word of intifada? What does it mean in English? To shake off. So the Palestinians said, under occupation, we're going to shake off the occupation by civil disobedience. And what did that get us? It got us international attention and broken bones. That was the Israeli Prime Minister's policy against the demonstrators. And my daughter's generation says, if the international attention turned a blind eye to the breaking of bones in the street, so what? We're still occupied. Even an intifada did not end the occupation. And then she goes on and she says, what happened next? You better remember, Dad. At the end of the first intifada, the Palestinian leadership accepted the US dictate that the only way to resolve this conflict is in bilateral negotiations. One table, Palestinians on one side and Israelis on the other side. And my daughter says, you want to convince our generation that talking is okay? When you brought me here in 1994, at the beginning of the negotiations, there were 100,000 settlers on the ground. After 20 years of negotiating, there's 600,000 settlers on the ground. Talking with the international community, turning a blind eye to the bulldozers going through the West Bank, didn't end the occupation. And then they're too polite, but what they want to say is, Dad, your generation is pretty stupid. You kept negotiating with Israel as they kept taking more land. It's like me and you being hungry and we order a pizza. And when it arrives, I ask you, how would you like to divide the pizza? And you take the first piece and you start eating it and you say, there's many ways, Sam, you can divide a pizza. And then you take the second piece. Well, the first way is, and you eat the second piece. And I'm a big guy. I'm starving and sweating at this point. And when there's one piece left, we close the box. And we said, with all the settlement expansion, there will be no land left. There will be no pizza left if we just keep talking. So we stopped the negotiations and we went back to the UN. But this time we didn't go to the plumbing of the UN. We went all the way to the top. We went to the Security Council first, and we took a resolution with our own hands. We placed it in front of the Security Council and said, is Palestine worthy of statehood or not? Because we failed in negotiating. And then we looked up and we found the Obama administration. We were happy. And the Obama administration looked at us and said, if you bring that to vote, we will veto it. We were shocked. We thought we were smart. You know how we drafted our resolution? We went to his speeches and took out some of the text and plugged it into our resolution. We wanted him to read his own words. But the U.S. is not made like that. It's not about a charismatic president. It's about a policy. So we said, no, Mr. President, you must have heard us wrongly. What we want is to put it into a Security Council committee to buy time. And that's where it sits today. Then we came back home to Ramallah. We went back 1 year later, 2012, I believe, and we took the same resolution to the General Assembly. We stood in front of the General Assembly, the most multilateral body in the world, and we said, world, you decide. Is Palestine worthy of statehood or not? What was the result? 138 countries said yes. 9 said no. The US, Israel, Canada, the Czech Republic, Panama, the superpower of Micronesia, the superpower of Peru, the superpower of the Marshall Islands, and the superpower of Nauru, if that's how you say it. 9, that's where the US put itself. And my daughter basically says, so what? The majority of the world said yes to Palestine, but the important ones which have military control over us said no. So we're still occupied. How does she end the story? How does her generation end this story? They say, Dad, maybe it's time that we deal with Israel differently than your generation. Maybe we should look Israel in the eye and say, Israel, we've been in one hell of a conflict. Congratulations. You win. You win. You get it all. You get Israel, you get the West Bank, you get West Jerusalem, you get East Jerusalem, you get all the settlements, we'll throw in Gaza for free, you get the water, you get the frequencies, and you know what else you get? Us. Now, we heard you have free health care in Israel. Where do we pick up our medical cards? The younger generation is standing at a fork in the road. Either they continue down the path of statehood, which means 2 states, which means Israel and Palestine will live on after the conflict, or they reach the conclusion, maybe we're too weak to create a state, and they drop statehood and convert this struggle to a civil rights struggle. Sitting Israeli prime ministers, sitting Israeli defense ministers have stated in public, if the Palestinians make that shift to civil rights, the game is over. It may take 100 years of an apartheid-style struggle, but the game is over. And my fear is one of the parties won't exist after we end the game. So I go back and tell my kids, I understand civil rights, but this is not Ohio and Pennsylvania. We have to understand that today, I don't know what's going to happen in 100 years, today we must be able to get the boot of occupation off of our neck so we can breathe freely. And that requires 2 states. 2 pure states that are independent, if there is anything such as independent today, that move forward, rehabilitate themselves, both need it, and in the future, hopefully there will be different generations of Palestinians and Israelis that will build bridges and not walls. But today, anyone who thinks that the occupation can continue as is, Trump included, is in for a shock. Because we're not going to make history in Palestine. We're not going to wake up one day and say, you know what, I kind of like this occupation. It's nice to have to go for an hour and 45 minutes instead of 20 minutes. It lets you see the landscape very, very nice. We're not going to do that. Not one people in history accepted a military occupation. We're not going to be the first. The last question that we have to answer today is how we will resist the occupation. I prefer to do it non-violently from basements of churches. Others in our community have said talking still doesn't work and they're moving more violently. So I will work 24/7 to make sure that we activate ourselves with the urgency required, because the issue is no longer the battleground of Jerusalem. The issue is the battleground of the USA. And here is where a policy change will bring the occupation to its knees. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I don't know if I'm going to drop that thing. You can hear me, right? So, I want to.
Pull it down.
Yeah, this is really the very important what I'm about to say, because I'm going to ask you for money. So, I really want you to hear me. Make me feel really short. First of all, I want to thank the Unitarian Church for having us, and I don't think we did that. And, organization for justice in the Middle East. And Ali, if back here, was really, really very helpful, and Dr. Herndon as well. I mean, I don't know if you're a doctor, but you're definitely a reverend. So I want to thank Friends of Sabeel North America, and there's several members in the room, and they've been very, very active. We've done a lot of work in Pittsburgh in the last several months, and Sam alluded to that in the very beginning. I'm with the Pittsburgh Palestine Solidarity Committee. We actively help to build this. We also have a newly formed, or forming, Justice for Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Pittsburgh. They have a sign-up sheet that you can sign. We really want you to sign up if you want to keep involved, keep active, but there have been several committees and coalitions. There's a Deadly Exchange Coalition that wants to stop the relationship between U.S. police and the Israeli military that's been active. There's been a Justice, a Jewish Voice for Peace organization that's been active as well. We want to, there's sign-up sheets, as I said, but also Sam did not charge us any money for that brilliant talk. And we want to pass the hat. He has an organization that he'll say what it is that he wants to give money to. So please be generous. This was, everything is kind of, I don't know, free at this point. We know that it's not free. So please help out with that, and then we're going to take a question and answer period. Okay, if you want to explain. Yeah, good luck with this.
I think my voice is down.
Oh, it's going to fall.
The organization that I mentioned, she mentioned, is called Al-Shabakeh. It's the Palestinian Policy Network. And I want to say why I'm involved in many organizations, but this one I picked for a reason. Kate asked me for a couple organizations in Palestine that we can all donate to. And I thought about it, and I did send some. And then I came back and said, you know what, Deb? This is after watching the media here for 1 week. I said, whatever we donate from Pittsburgh to the big mega problems in Palestine are probably not going to make a dent. Where I see efforts are needed is in the country. And Al-Shabakeh, the policy network, is actually the network that works on policy papers from Palestinian voices and positioning them with American legislators, as well as other legislators, but we're based in Washington. So you can look that up. It's Al-Shabakeh. And there's many other organizations, but I thought tonight it would be good to work on policy-related things in the States as it relates to Palestine. So that's that organization. Questions, comments? Just don't throw shoes. Yes. Sir?
Given the fact that you are an American citizen and also aware that it's the policy of this country that enables this creeping success of the Israeli overthrow of the Palestinian homeland, if you could wave a magic wand, not in Ramallah and not in Tel Aviv, but in Washington, D.C., short of there being elected a Palestinian president in the United States or a Palestinian majority in the Congress, short of that, what would you do with your magic wand in Washington, D.C.?
Good question. I would remove lobby money from our politics, whether it applies to Palestine or it applies to school shootings and NRA. The money of the lobbies are influencing this short-term and short-sighted political process to the point where it's corrupted our politicians. So there's many things that can happen. First and foremost, people to re-engage in the political system. It is so corrupt, it is so far away from the average American. That's not what democracy is about. So getting back into civic life from churches, from organizations, from unions, I think is key. So people, normal, average people without hidden agendas are back into our political world. That's what legislation is all about. It's not about some elitist group of people that happen to be funded by even a larger elitist group of people, and all of a sudden everything becomes detached from reality. So to be able to get normal people, average people into office and no longer look at public office as some kind of stay away from, but rather to say, this is our country, we're taking it back. And we're taking it back not from Trump, because Trump, whether we like it or not, is part of this country. We're taking it back from the lobbyists who are working behind the scenes to get the politicians to do things which are no longer in the strategic interest of the US. There's bipartisan reports after the Gulf War. The Iraq study is a bipartisan report. Both parties came together and said, the issue in the Middle East is not Iraq after we destroyed Iraq. It's the Palestine-Israel conflict. That was a bipartisan documented in Congress. Where's the policy to start working to end it? And so that's what I would do. I would work to get these money out of our political system, at least not in the way it is today. There's a side note to that as well. In the US, there's something called a 501c3 status. It's a tax-deductible status for nonprofit organizations. The organization I just mentioned is one of those. I would start looking deep into the organizations which are getting tax-deductible status and are funding settlement activity. How can we give tax deductions to people who are working against formal US policy, which by the way is about to change if Trump gets his way. But it doesn't make sense that we say, we're for 2 states, but we allow NGOs to get money, not taxed, and send it to more settlements so they can build more settlements. Settlements are non-conducive to a 2-state solution. So that law needs to be looked at in much more scrutiny as well. Sir?
You kind of indicated that you support still the 2-state solution. There are plenty of experts who think that's no longer possible. You also sort of said that you don't think the occupation can continue indefinitely.
Yes.
And I'm sure you have good reasons for that. But I sort of, from what I research, agree with the people who say the 2-state solution is pretty much over. So to me, and Israel's not going to permit a 1-state situation. So to me, the current situation, the status quo, to me, is the way it's going to go indefinitely. I wonder what you think about that.
Until Gazans say no longer and start heading to the border with kites and demos, popular movements don't send an SMS before they act. I assume our popular movement will rise again in a way we don't know to make sure that the current situation, the status quo, is no longer able to continue. I agree with you. There are many people who call for 1 state. I've written a policy paper recently about this, and it's called the asynchronous struggle between rights and endgame. Rights and endgame. What has been the status quo so far? We're in this negotiating process, and yes, there's a lot of violations of rights, but they've been tucked away behind an endgame. People are saying, as soon as there's a state, you'll get your rights. Focus on the state. And after the failure of Oslo, I want to detach those 2 things. First, rights. Rights are something now that need to be addressed. An American citizen who can't go into Tel Aviv airport like a fellow American citizen, that's a right. We need to address it today. It can't wait. The end game is a political end game. The end game of 2 states is not a menu item on a restaurant menu. Because if I had to decide which menu option, 4 states are better than 2. 6 are even better, then you can go and have a vacation in 5 of them. The issue is not what I or you or a voice in that wilderness wants to call for. Whether we like it or not, there is a political crux to this conflict, and we have, as Palestinians, a political agency. That's a very important word. The US has a political agency too. It's called the Trump administration. It doesn't matter that he's a minority president. He assumed the agency of the US. The Palestinian side has its internal problems, big time, and I can write a lot about that. But we have what it is what it is. It's a Palestinian political agency which has defined 2 states as its strategic choice moving forward. So in my policy paper, I choose, whether I like it or not, that's a different story, I choose the same direction that the political Palestinian agency has chosen. But I can say it very comfortably. Why? Because I'm convinced Israel's not giving 2 states, 1 state, or even rights. So when do I make the shift? When do I say, as a Palestinian, when do I say, 2 states is over, let's shift to 1 state? What my daughter's generation is talking about. We do it when we have enough allies that see it the way we see it. This is not a sport. It's not about getting the next goal. You have to bring fans with you. You have to bring political allies with you. We can stand up today and I can make a very strong argument that you're right. 2 states is history. And the legislation that's being passed in Israel these days is making that very visible. But I won't do that today because ultimately my issue today is rights and getting the occupation to end. How the political endgame ends is for Palestinians and Israelis to decide, not me as an American. And I'll take the cue from the Palestinian political agency. When we see that more countries, and believe me, more countries are seeing that Israel has no intention to allow another state to emerge, there'll come a time, a turning point, where the Palestinians officially will say, we are dropping statehood, you should be happy, Israel, and we're converting this to a civil rights movement. I don't know if you're going to be happy or not. That can only happen at the right political time, and I would highly encourage our solidarity movement to not spend time on 1 state or 2 states, given both of them are very far in the future, but to put our efforts in rights today and allow the Palestinians to work politically to see what's the best time to make a strategic shift in their strategy. Sir?
So I'm an Israeli, and several things I'll say, and then I'll ask for your opinion. So it's very painful to hear all this, and we all, by the way, in Israel are aware of this, at least half of this thing. And one of the problems that came with the Oslo Agreement, which demolished the camp that I belonged to, which is the left camp, or even the liberal camp, was the wave of terror that created a complete mistrust. And basically actually made us politically useless in every argument. And we're losing elections since, and I don't see the end of it. But to your point that we passed the point where there's no two-state solution, I would argue that's not true. Israel demolished its own cities in the past for peace agreements, and I think that the drive for peace in Israel is much stronger than people think. I know that the government in Israel right now is equivalent to the Trump administration. Netanyahu and Trump for me is the same thing. But I think that I would like to hear your opinion as to, I think it's a problem of trust. It's a very deep problem of trust that Israelis find hard actually to believe. And if we go even to when you summarized and said, well, we look at 48, well, so when Israelis look at 48, right, what they see is the land was divided and one side attacked the other. And they think, okay, we're not to blame, we were attacked. When Palestinians say, well, if we sign peace, there is a right to return, so let me tell you another thing about me. I'm Israeli, but my family came from Iraq. So, and I don't know if the audience know that, but half of the population in Israel are refugees, basically, from the Arab states. I mean, like, the population in Baghdad used to be 25% Jewish. There's probably about 5 Jews left there right now. So it's a complex situation of moving populations, and it's a very vast trust issue that developed over those years. So, and the problem for us in the left that want and fought for so many years to promote the two-state solution is that we ran into this wall, which started actually during the period after the Oslo Agreement, which created a complete mistrust in the Israeli voter population.
Thank you for your question. I want to start by the...
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Yes. The question has like 3 parts to it. One is that the bulk of the Israeli population, Jewish Israeli population, are originally from Arab states, so they are refugees from Arab states, as was stated. The other is there's mistrust that came with the wave of violence, which caused the left in Israel to become basically ineffective. And your first point was, those were the two main ones. I want to touch on the last one first. Yes, there are issues that happen in the Arab world which caused Jews to leave the Arab world. The main cause was a call from the Zionist movement for Jews to come to Israel, of course. In addition to that, there are acts that happen, black flag acts, I'm sure you know the Lavon affair, in Cairo, by the way, where the Israeli government went and bombed places in Jewish neighborhoods so people would be enticed to come back. And I'm sure there's discrimination which caused people to leave. So I'm sure there's more than 5 Jews in Egypt today, but I hear what you're saying. The point I need to make is we don't have a power of attorney from all 22 Arab states to take responsibility for their actions. If people are wrong, they need to talk to the right party. I mean, any court of law, the first thing they want to make sure is they want to make sure the 2 right parties are in the room. We're not a party to any Arab world decision which caused Jews to move anywhere. This is number 1. Number 2, the fear factor, I get that. And I agree with you, and I actually think that the adoption of violence during the second Intifada was a strategic mistake on the Palestinian side. A lot of times enticed by Israeli actions, and I can give you a live example today. When we had the Great March that started on the 30th of March, announced by civil society, not by Hamas, you've probably seen the CNN interview of the person who started the campaign, of taking 40 to 50,000 Gazans to the fence where the Israelis stand. It's not a border, because Israel hasn't defined this border yet. And they were met with what on the first day of this nonviolent demonstration? 120 Israeli snipers. And you saw how they were plucking people like they were in a fish tank. Israel begs for violence because it's the only game book it has.
But my point is that there is a difference between the Israeli people and the current government.
Yeah, that was the third point, and I want to get to that as well. Because when we Palestinians, we have this disease, is that we look at things in historical context. When we see the left in the 70s, which was in its heyday, launching the settlement enterprise, and every single left government from that day until today maintains Israel's settlement building, we can't make ends meet in that discussion. We've seen successive Israeli governments, right and left, extreme right like today, all following the same trajectory as it relates to the Palestinian side. Today you have an Israeli government led by someone from the Likud party, like the Republicans and Democrats. There's a Likud party. That party of Benjamin Netanyahu, until today, 2018, refuses to put in its political platform 2 states. So who are we actually talking to when we talk to the Israelis? I do fully agree with you that that entire political level doesn't necessarily represent grassroots Israel. I talk to a lot of Israelis in the business community. They're worried. They're worried. Israel is becoming more contracted in the global community because of this stupid occupation. And I know a lot of the business community are saying, Netanyahu, what the hell are you doing? BDS has become an issue in Israel. They've legislated against it. They're legislating against it here. And it's basically saying to Israel, you know, if you and I had a business and we were making $5 billion a year, would we sell it? Probably not. Unless I took you to the best restaurant in Pittsburgh and everybody stood up and said, oh, there he goes. He's the guy who deals in cocaine with Sam. You'd probably come to me and say, Sam, our business deal is over. And we'd probably never see each other again. What the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement is, it's the finger. That's about it. It's not going to bring Israel to its knees. But it's globally going to point to Israel wherever it goes, in the business community, in the sports community, in the arts community, and it's going to say, Israel, you are dealing in a toxic substance, left and right Israel. It's called military occupation. So they've criminalized that non-violent act of a finger being pointed at them. The business community sees this. Exports in some countries have dropped in Israel. So I agree with you. Like in the States, the government doesn't necessarily represent all of the people. But Israel is a special case as well, because Israel sends its boys and girls after high school into the military. Not all of them end up in the occupied territory, but a great majority of them see and act in a form of a military occupier. So we have to assume as Israelis that they see what's happening. And we see some civil rights and human rights organizations in Israel which are more vocal than the Palestinians. There's an organization called Breaking the Silence. Combat soldiers in Israel, not peaceniks, combat soldiers who come out of Hebron and they said, we're breaking the silence. We are going to speak up in the Israeli community and say, we love Israel, we will defend Israel. The occupation has nothing to do with defending Israel. They have now been legislated not to enter high schools in Israel out of fear that they'll get more students to be refuseniks to go into the army. So there's a lot to be swallowed in that question. Okay?
Sam, could you comment? I'm thinking three things. One is conditions in Gaza, what that looks like for people living there. Number two, conditions inside Israel for Palestinians and whether or not, a lot of people think of Israel as a democracy that's fair to the minority population. I see it a little differently, so could you comment about that? And also, I think there's an uptick in arresting journalists, poets, writers that are Palestinian. Could you comment about those violations?
Very briefly, each one of those can take a whole talk. But definitely Gaza needs its own platform. I highlighted it in the beginning. I refuse to talk about Palestine without bringing Gaza into the picture. The UN said before the last war, if we want to even call it a war, I call it military onslaught in Gaza, that Gaza would be unlivable in 2020. Then they had a war for 40, 50 days. Today, Gaza is unlivable. Gazans today are saying they're equating life with death. So no wonder people are charging the border. Not 40,000, but some are. No wonder some are taking up weapons. They have nothing to live for. And those 101 items that I'm going to talk about, those actions that Israel can take, which will not affect its security, a lot of them have to do with Gaza. A lot of them have to do with Gaza. Gazans live on 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day for the last 10 years. In Youngstown, we had a blackout for 20 minutes. We almost had a fit in the house because the Wi-Fi went down. For 10 years, they haven't had full electricity. I had a business in Gaza of translation, and I refused to cut them off because I wanted to support them even after the issue happened with the siege of Gaza. And then I found out they weren't turning around the translations in time. Turns out they don't have electricity. She went and bought a generator to make sure she can get her deliverable to me. Didn't have gas at one point, so I had to drop them. The basic stuff to allow people to have a livelihood is not there, let alone access. Let alone access. I have a business, a consulting business in Ramallah. Tomorrow morning, I would open a branch in Gaza if I was allowed to by the Israeli military. I think I can give Gazans a livelihood more than Hamas can give them. But I gotta be there to do it. And Israel knows exactly what it's doing when it creates this ghetto called Gaza. And basically it's eating itself from the inside. They had to build tunnels to bring in foodstuffs, but that also brought in weapons. Today, Hamas is not the most dangerous party in Gaza. We have parties that we've never heard about in Gaza, who are actually, many of them, throwing the missiles into Israel to try to shake Hamas's position as a governing body. So yes, we have, I said at the beginning of my talk, there are no angels in this conflict, but I follow a very strict principle in international law of proportionality. Yes, if we throw a missile into an open field in Sderot from Gaza, that is illegal under international law and we should be held accountable. But if you maintain a military siege for 50 years on a people, if you send F-16s to bomb residential neighborhoods, that's in proportion should be held accountable as well. So Gaza is something that it's exploding in front of us. Trump sees this. The Trump administration wants to make a grand deal, the deal of the century, by solving the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, thinking Palestinians are going to forget that they have national and civil rights. It's going to fail as much as I hope his presidency fails. The other point about Palestinians inside Israel, that's a talk in itself as well. The Israeli legislative body just produced a new legislation called the nation-state law, which if anybody had a doubt about the Jewish and democracy, the democracy part of it, that has been flushed down the toilet. That new law, which has been added to their basic law, they don't have a constitution, but they have a basic law, basically codifies that this is a country for Jews only to have full rights. Even the Arabic language, which interestingly from the day Israel was created until last week or 2 weeks ago, remained the second official language, was demoted to a special language. So even the language is causing problems in their nightmares. You're talking about 2 million Palestinians, Muslim and Christian, inside Israel. And I want to link these two questions together because once I went to a talk in Jerusalem at the Ambassador Hotel. An Israeli minister was speaking, Gideon Eiser. He passed away recently. But he talked about peace, and I had read his history. This guy was a security person par excellence. So I waited till he finished, and I raised my hand, and he picked on me, and I said, "Sir, I want you for 1 second to forget about the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Pretend like they dropped off the map. I want to talk about Israel proper. Your statisticians are saying that there'll be more non-Jews in Israel than Jews, and I think it was 15 years at that time. What are you going to do?" He didn't blink. He looked at me and he said, "Sir, the Arabs have 22 states, they can go to any of them. We have only one." He wasn't talking about me in Ramallah. He was talking about the Muslim and Christian Palestinians in Nazareth, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, that he represents as a minister, saying if they get to a specific number, they can leave. I was going to make a joke and say, can you imagine someone telling the Hispanics if you get to a specific number, you can leave? But it's happening here too. No wonder there's a special relationship with no sunshine, no disinfectant. It's just no sunshine between the two sides, Israel and the US. The only two states that have such a special relationship, maybe because they come from the same narrative in addressing their conflict. And the last question you gave was
the attack on journalists and
the attacks these days are non-ending. I mean, just like we're all following the next Twitter message, in Israel we wake up in the morning and we're following where's the next place that we have to go address. Is it Khan al-Ahmar, the Bedouin community that they're trying to move? Is it house demolitions? Is it Ahad Tamimi, the 16-year-old girl who slapped a fully armed soldier because he was in the front of her house and spent, I think, 6 months in jail? Where the settler that lives next door to her, I actually think shot someone and was out like in 18 days. These kinds of discrepancies between the attack, and it's very clear for us. Israel sees Trump administration as a window. They're going to press hard. You know, when they went to the embassy, to move the embassy to Jerusalem, no Democrat attended that event. You know that. No Democrat actually went and attended that event. Trump sent a clergy person to open the invocation, is that how they say it? And he's a person who has a history of saying he can't wait for Armageddon to come, so we can collect all the Jews inside Israel and then be done with them. That's who Trump sent to open the embassy. And this guy is off. And the Israeli government, not people, because if you go today to the Israeli public, where I interact, they weren't so excited that the embassy won. They believe that it should be in Jerusalem, but they're smarter to know that you don't do it outside of a process. It was done outside of a process. And it's just this, the last thing I want to say here on this, it's a broader issue of the US-Palestinian relationship. When we entered the Madrid peace process, how many of you are old enough to remember Madrid, before Oslo? The Madrid peace process was the Palestinians telling the US, you be the judge. We think you're a fair country. You be the judge. We're going to come and negotiate. And Haider Abdel-Shafi and Saab Arakat and Hanan Ashrawi and these folks, they went and negotiated in Madrid. Unknowing to them, Arafat was negotiating secretly in Oslo. When Oslo came up, the Israelis had already saw that the case the Palestinians were making in Madrid was solid. So they worked on the American side. They turned the judge into the attorney. So throughout the entire Oslo process, the US acted as an attorney. That's actually a word that was used by one of the advisors of the US that was in Camp David. He said, we were basically the attorney of Israel. Israel would tell us what they want, we would turn around and package it to the Palestinians, maybe dump a little bit of money to get them to take it. And then when Trump came, the judge that moved to an attorney is now the policeman. It's not about making policy, it's about implementing Israeli policy. And the embassy move is part of implementing the policy. Moving the Bedouin community is part of implementing the policy. Trying to withdraw funds from the UNRWA, which is the refugee agency, to try to get the entire refugee status changed, is part of implementing the Israeli agenda. It's a sad time for the US and the Middle East, especially when it comes to Palestine and Israel. Sir?
I want to ask you a question. I want to get a clearer picture. Don't you think that negotiation is the best way to solve this problem?
Yes, I do.
Well, what happened when Arafat was negotiating, and he got 90% of what he wanted? Abbas negotiated, he got 90% of what he wanted. They turned it down.
Yep.
Yep, 90, if I negotiated with you and I got 90% of what I wanted, I think I'd take it.
What's the closest prison to this church?
Pardon?
What's the closest Pittsburgh prison to this church? Is there one? I can guarantee you that the prisoners have access to about 97% of the prison. The 3% called the doors are not theirs. Having a percentage game doesn't work. When we say terms to be able to create a state, it's not terms pulled out of a black hat. It's terms based in international law. It's terms based in UN resolutions. It's actually terms which have been signed by Israel in the Oslo process.
Are you telling me you know what the terms were?
There were no terms, sir. There was a discussion. There were no terms. There wasn't a deal to be made. How do I know that? How do I know that?
I don't know.
Let me give you a hint. Maybe it's right. It could be wrong. I mean, we could all be wrong, right? In today's Google world, we can say the moon is pink, and somebody will agree with us. Probably 1,476,000 people. I read a lot about the people who were in the meeting at Camp David. People like Shlomo ben Ami. He was the foreign minister of Israel at the time of the negotiations. He stated there was no deal. Like Robert Malley, the U.S. special advisor to the Clinton administration who was in the room, he said there was nothing to sign. There was discussions about issues. And by the way, one other thing we should keep in mind, in context, Arafat didn't want to go to the Camp David Accords. He didn't want to go to the Camp David meeting. And this is well documented. He told the Clinton administration, the Israelis are not ready. Clinton told him, come, negotiate, and I promise you, there will be no blame if it doesn't come out right. 1 week after the negotiations failed, the Clinton administration laid the blame game. It's the game that you're mentioning, that there was a generous offer, and they didn't accept it. And in Tabo, they were even closer. It was about 97%, and they didn't accept it. I can take 2% of your house and keep you in prison forever. You would not accept that, sir. We are basing our exit to this conflict in law. Either we're people together, as Americans I speak now, either we're people who respect the rule of law, or we're not. We're either people who want to use parameters who have already been identified, or we're not. There's two bodies of law. We have to pick one. There's international law, and there's the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle, I can play there, because I'm a pretty big guy. International law, we can all play there. And yes, there has to be a parameter that is third party. We cannot accept a parameter that comes out of our occupier's hat. Ma'am?
Can I just add to that? What I read is that Ehud Barak knew very well that he was lying when he said, oh, that was a great deal, and he turned it down. What they would have gotten would have been basically the holes in the Swiss cheese. That would have been their stake.
This is
Holes in the Swiss cheese.
to help this conversation, let me make a note.
Yeah.
It's history.
I even know we were in Pittsburgh. I don't know myself. All I read was that they were offering 90%, they turned it down. I don't know anything else.
Let me help you. I mean, there's a rice Institute for Studies. You can go and see that there's actually deep reports about the percentages with maps. You can read it, but let me make it easy for all of us tonight. It doesn't matter anymore. It's over. We didn't sign the dotted line. The conflict still exists. Anybody who wants to take that reality and say, Palestinians, too bad, you didn't sign, you're going to live like this forever, I'll chuckle. Because we've been living like this for 50 years. We can probably live another 50. I'm wondering if Israel can live the way it's living, stopping Jewish Americans who are entering Israel because they're vocal. I don't think they can keep the Jewish community's support for the state of Israel if they continue on the track of battering Gaza, of displacing Bedouins, of house demolitions, of children's arrests. That's not what Judaism is about. And if anyone thinks that's a reflection of a state of Jews, I don't think they've read Judaism, because what little I know about Judaism, I know that there is a pillar in that faith called social justice. And that's why I speak to Jewish communities most of my free time. I don't need to exaggerate. I just need to bring reality to their face, and I know at one point, and I've seen it live, their social justice will kick in. I don't want them to become Palestinian. I want them to hold Israel accountable for its wrongs, and hold us accountable too. In proportion. In proportion.
Somebody here with his hand up. saying-
Sir, in the back?
Oh, well, we touched on two things that I was going to have kind of neat was one, the relationship between U.S. foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy of prisons. Can you comment on the other shared trait that we have here in this country is the prison industrial complex that takes place in Israel? I know Ansar 3 is probably the most famous.
Sure.
What's the current state of that?
The relationship between the U.S. and Israel is a special relationship. Not only are they the largest foreign recipient of our aid, even though they thrive, and Benjamin Netanyahu gets up in the middle of Washington, D.C. and brags about how high-tech they are and how leading they are in the world as an economy. And then when it comes time for appropriations bill, they say we need that $3 billion a year. Many Israelis, by the way, average Israelis, wish that money would stop. Because the undue influence that it applies to the Israeli system, when the Israelis can actually deal without it, is heavy. But there's also many new kinds of post-9/11 relationships that after 9/11, the security complex, industrial complex has become huge. So Israel today is an exporter of weaponry. That's new. That's the last 15 years. When you become an exporter of weapons, you have a different relationship with third states. Because if I sell you my tanks, you don't want to make a mess with me. Because you need parts, you need training, you need supplies. So Israel has entered supplying arms into some of the shadiest characters in town. And I'm not talking about the Iran-Contra deal that was done way back in the 80s. In a way which has positioned them with other states to make sure other states have a vested interest not to hold Israel accountable. Israel has gone further than that. They bring many U.S. police departments to Israel to train them, to show them how they have this population in the back door called Palestinians. And we can practice new bombs like the dime bomb that hits the top of the rooftop and then spreads out and kills anybody on the, or cuts off limbs of anybody on the rooftops. These are being practiced on us. I used to have a hard time convincing people of this. And then luckily, some very brave Israelis do documentaries to show within the Israeli system how this happens. One of them is called The Lab. And I highly recommend you, Yotom, I forget his last name, did a documentary about how this entire security industrial complex works. And he goes into some of the exhibitions, you know, the security people have these exhibitions where they go and look at the shiniest new gear and so forth. So he goes to the booth where the Israelis are selling. And the guy, in so many words, is saying, our stuff is better than the booth next door. We practice on it every day. We have a population. And that's not only weapons. It's HP fingerprint scanning. It's eye optical scanning at the checkpoints. It's the cameras that can read our license plates and pop up if there's a problem with a car. All of that technology is being used in service of the occupation, but in service of a business in Israel as well. And I always say, let's not only look at the political part of this. When I said $5 billion, that's a real number. Israel benefits $5 billion from our economy. mainly in electricity and in hospital services and in petroleum. There's a lot of business in Israel that is doing very well, given they have a captive audience. And that's one of the reasons I established something called Americans for a Vibrant Palestinian Economy. It's a nonprofit based in Chicago, where we try to link American businesses with Palestinian businesses. And I highly encourage you to look at that, because what we're trying to tell Palestinians and Americans, we don't always have to go through our occupier. And I have a hidden agenda. I want to educate corporate America about occupation. If I go to them like a talk today and talk about UN resolutions, they just look right over me. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So I want to go instead to Mr. Haya and say, Mr. Haya, hi. I saw you have a lot of properties, hotels in the entire Arab world. You don't have one in Palestine. He goes, no, we have one in Pakistan. I said, yes, you do, but not Palestine. And then he goes, where is that? And I tell him, do you know where Bethlehem is? He goes, yes, we sing about that every Sunday in church. Yes, that's the one. It has a wall around it. Would you think your customers might know Bethlehem? It's been branded for a while now. And then we try to convince Mr. Haya to open up a hotel in Bethlehem. That way, when he tries to send his beds through the ports, because Israel controls all ports into the Palestinian territory, and they get stopped, I'm hoping when Mr. Haya calls Prime Minister Netanyahu, he'll pick up the phone, because he's definitely not picking it up when Sam calls.
We take two more, Sam.
As many as you want, I'm here for you.
Can you just spell the name of the organization?
I'll give you their website, it's easier, because it's a very long name. The number 4, VPE.org.
Thank you.
Our new website will come up, but the information is there. By the way, I have a blog that has all this information on it. It's epalestine.com. It's not a fancy blog, but it has a lot of information, including a list of suggested documentaries that has the documentary that I listed. It has another one too, a new one that came out last year, called The Occupation of the American Mind. Highly encourage you to listen to that one as well. Sir.
You obviously know what you're talking about.
Thank you.
And there's no argument. You've lived there for many, many years.
Not everybody can
Speak up.
You've lived in Ramallah for many years. You know the situation. You're a political activist. You're a businessman. Everything you said tonight rings true in terms of personally the years of study and work and activism I've done on this. You know what Israel is doing. You know what Israel's intentions are. You know the consequences of Israel's actions. And yet, you're still, it seems to me, accepting the corrupt agency, as you call it, of the PLO, of the PA, as the one you're following. And it's been proven for so long now, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, as to the deep-seated corruption of the PA and how it has betrayed the Palestinian people for so long, particularly its leadership, particularly Abbas, and the collaboration with Israel for so many years now. And yet to still talk about two states, it seems to me, plays into the hands of this corrupt PA and, of course, the corrupt Israeli government. And furthermore, if I can just go on for a second, the occupation that you want to end is not any longer really, technically, legally, an occupation. Because all of the aspects in international law, which you rightly want us all to follow in this world, that Israeli occupation is in violation of that international law. They've settled 800,000 citizens of Israel in the occupation. They destroyed the people's lands, they've taken the water, they've taken the air, they've taken everything. And they continue to take everything. So technically, under international statutes, it's not an occupation. It's apartheid. Because, as you said yourself, you can't go anywhere from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River without being under the full control of the Israeli army and government. So why would we want to continue to support and advocate for a two-state system, or the idea of rights,
Gotcha.
when Israel obviously, and to you, from what I'm hearing tonight, understand better than any of us how they're not letting up, they're not taking that boot off our neck, but your daughter and her generation, who is calling for one state, who is calling for the end of an apartheid state and the beginning of a democratic state, you're not listening to her. And that's the generation we need to be listening to, I think.
I hear you. First, your first part about corruption, I have to chuckle when anyone asks me about corruption. Remember, I come from Youngstown, Ohio. When I left in 1994, my congressman was in jail, my prosecutor in jail, and one of the city council persons was about to go to jail. So I know a little bit about corruption, at least living under it at least. The political, I don't sleep well at night. Because remember, I'm a Palestinian-American. Both political agencies can be applied to what you said. They have corruption heavy in them, and I don't know how representative they are anymore. However, like it or not, politics is not about justice, it's about facts of agency. These are facts of agencies. Until we Palestinians, can get our act together and change our agency, you get what we got.
That's true.
And now I put my American hat on. Until we can get our act together as Americans and change this piece of, you know what, we got what we got. So I don't sleep, because both of those I have to face every day. Having said that, I do accept two states moving forward for one simple reason. I don't have a better alternative. Why? Because I have a premise that I'm working on, and I mentioned it earlier. Post-conflict, I want to see both countries and both communities live on. Because I know if either one is diminished to zero, the conflict will never end. The only one we have in front of us today as a solution that allows both parties to live on is a two-state solution. By the way, it's actually, playing politics now, the one that the entire international community has signed on to. In addition, 138 countries recognized. That didn't come easy. That came with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And when you get that far, and all you have is the US to switch, you keep working to change the US. Nobody asked to go from occupation, the frying pan of occupation, to the fire of apartheid. I see what you see. We're heading into an apartheid reality if we're not already there. And I tell my Israeli friends, I can play the Netanyahu game. Okay, it's not occupation. It's not occupation. What is it? When there's two bodies of law applied to people living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, that's called apartheid. I don't want to go there, consciously. Why? Because if I go there, I've jumped into the frying pan of apartheid, and then I dictate to my children for the next 100 years to have a civil rights movement. That's going to come one day if we, Americans, don't get our act together and end the occupation, which I think we could do. Because if we can do it, then both communities can rehabilitate. And believe me, both need rehabilitation. We for sure, but Israelis for sure too. I happen to read a lot about the Israeli community. I look at domestic violence numbers in Israel. They're on the rise. Of course they are. You can't send your nice Jewish kids into the West Bank and they play Wild Wild East, and then after 2 years they come back and being your nice Jewish kids. What they witnessed will pour over into the Israeli society. And many other examples as well. So both societies need to be able to rehabilitate forward, but my premise, it may not be yours, is I want to see both peoples live on. And that's not only, Edward Said said that in his writings as well. Israel cannot win with all of its military might, and we cannot lose with all of the justice in our cause. So we have to find a way, like the person in the back said, to negotiate forward. So I think you had misunderstood me. I am fully for two states. I was answering him in terms of what the other generation is saying. Will I stay like this? I'll do it until when? Until my daughter becomes the agency. And when the younger generation gets elected and gets into power, I assume they'll look back and say, thanks for trying, Dad, but we're too weak to create a state. We are committed to moving on to a civil rights movement. That's their decision, not mine to dictate to them. So what I do is I'm very vocal in Arabic and in English, and you can read my stuff on the site, which talk about the need for a Palestinian political system to get its act together, so all Palestinians around the world can have a voice in it. And then whatever the Palestinians decide, I will follow track. I may not like it. I may end up back in Pittsburgh or Youngstown. But at the end of the day, today we have a path forward. And until that changes, and I'm working to get it changed, I'm hoping to get it changed so we can reinforce negotiations to a two-state solution. I may fail. But it is in our benefit to remain focused on two states. The other side would love to see us to get in a battle every day about 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, 6 states. I like Florida, basically. We can do that while they trample our rights every day. I'd rather say international law says 2 states, I'm for 2 states. Now let's talk about what we're going to do today about our rights.
Sam, you had a question?
Sir?
Can you sort of say something about the Christian context, from the fundamentalist, apocalyptic right locked in with the Trump people, and on the other hand, Pope Francis in a kind of a different type of dynamic, and what he did in the Holy Land with in Bethlehem with the wall, and that. Just give a sense of that kind of context, because I think it's a very important one.
I'll start with a percentage inside Palestine. The Christian community in Palestine, I'm talking about West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, has fallen the last 15 years from 20 years from about 12% down to 2 to 3%. That's a huge drop in the Holy Land of Christians. Christians are under attack. And I don't believe it's under attack because of Muslims. And I speak to you as a half Christian, half Muslim myself. It's under attack because the Christian communities, which is basically the Beit Jala area between Bethlehem and between Jerusalem, in the Second Intifada came under attack. For Christians, it's easier to integrate into the US, right? It's a Judeo-Christian society. It's much harder in 2018 for Muhammad Ahmed Abdul Halim to move into New York. So you find that there's a verge for the Christian community to leave the country when it comes under crisis. Not all, even in Gaza we still have a Christian community. But I don't separate what happens to the Christian community to what happens to the overall community. Actually, the dissecting of our community by religion is something that's kind of an artificial thing that happens in academic discussions outside of the country. I've been there 25 years, I honestly can't tell you on my street who's Muslim and who's Christian. I may know, but it's not confirmed. That distinction is one of the divide and conquer tools that Israel has used historically. In the Second Intifada, I witnessed one. They put up a checkpoint between Ramallah and Birzeit University. I was on the board of Birzeit University. We would never be able to go in the car all the way to Birzeit. We went halfway, parked the car, got off, got checked by the soldiers, got into a hantur, it's a donkey cab. It's a cart. And he would take you 100 meters to the other side, and then you take a cab and you go to the meeting. Once I was at that checkpoint, a bus of students stopped. The soldiers said, all Christian beautiful women get off, and in this line, all ugly women get off on the other line. I watched this with my hands. You know what happened? The entire bus got off and stood in one line. This is the way we kind of address this. There are issues, I'm sure. I mean, there's no community that doesn't have any issues. But our issue is not a religious issue.
No, I meant more the context of
the context is Trump serving his allegiance.
Yeah.
Trump is serving his lobby. The move of the embassy, and that's what I had mentioned, that the Israeli community at large saw this as a premature kind of move, even though they may be committed to it. He was serving the Christian evangelicals here. When did he do that? It's when his ex-national security advisor was called in for going to court. So I assume as he gets more deeper into his hole, the grand plan of the century will come out to move everyone's attention somewhere else. This is divide and conquer. This is, I mean, in the 80s, I went to Grenada after they had liberation of Grenada. I thought, I'm going to Grenada. They liberated Grenada. And the plane, I could hardly see the island. It landed. I told my dad, this is where we're coming. I could have took this over myself. But that's where the U.S. sent the Marines when they got hit with the Marines in Lebanon. They needed to take attention off and create a quick win. That was in Grenada. So this moving attention around, and it's shocking to us that the Israelis are buying into it. This Christian evangelical community is talking about Armageddon. You know the rest.
Sam, just one more, because we need,
One more. Anybody have a question, comment?
we're hanging around the.
Let me ask
You have your chance. Let's see if anybody else. If nobody else has a question,
I'll say a comment.
I'm gonna ask
you had a question.
I'm cheering from the back of the room.
You had your comment as well. Let's see if anybody else that didn't speak yet. Anybody else?
If not, then we can
That's a Democrat.